in your world, how do you define creativity? What does creativity mean to you?
I think the move is increasingly becoming about almost defining terms, and in this area probably innovation, and for reasons of innovation being searched more than creativity or entrepreneur, was told to me via the people we know in Cincinnati, the Innovation Engineering Institute, that taken over a lot of the Deming type work. So innovation is probably the form of creativity or the terminology that I'm most around now, because in business, and it's not just business by any means, because we work with sports teams as well, but pretty much business or any team that wants to prevail over an opponent has to innovate. They have to find new solutions. They have to do different things, and yet it's often seen as a periphery or peripheral task. And a lot of our work would be about bringing innovation and creativity right to the center of the table, right to the center of the agenda, so people can start to look at it and say, how do we improve? How do we get better? How do we involve people? So it's increasingly, it's a bit like everybody talks today, but nobody really defines it. Well, innovation and creativity is somehow in that place. Everybody seems to think it's important, but nobody's really defining it. And that's, with some partners, that's a big part of what we're trying to do now.
Yes, it's true. Well, very often the difference between creativity and innovation is seen to be that innovation is the practical implementation of creativity. Okay. So it makes sense that in the business world we would consider innovation to be really a lot more important than creativity, because creativity might not have a practical, it might not result in any outcomes that will make any economic difference or return on investment. And in academia, the definition of creativity very often, always involves at least two concepts. One is the concept of value, and the other is the concept of originality. And by originality, we can think of something being new, something being surprising, something being different from the norm. And value could be effective, it could be useful, it could be appropriate for the situation. So there's always those two concepts involved in creativity, the concept of originality and the concept of value. And as you appreciate that in innovation, something has to be valuable for it to be innovative, because otherwise it's not going to result in any financial return on investment. So in that respect, how do you recognize creativity? How do you recognize innovation?
In business generally, you mean, or?
Yes. So when I know that that's your positioning, you are positioned in the business world. So in that world, how do you, as a judge, as an evaluator of creativity or innovation, how do you recognize creativity, or how do you recognize innovation?
I think the whole work with the innovation engineers people, they're the ones that have defined the processes, and it does follow on from the Deming work over the years. And what we often find is there isn't protocols to encourage creativity. So it's always seen as a fluke or a byproduct. So, the way, even coming back to early days of programs, going back 20, 25 years ago, daft little things of the famous suggestion box in a cover opens, or it's just got dust over it, that companies that started to use the suggestion box as quite symbolic for taking things that customers had taken the time, and years ago it was a physical box, and today it may be online or whatever it is, but actually taking those suggestions and passing them out to the managers or the people in the organization and making that part of the business processes. And then when Mrs. Smith from 47 Acacia Avenue suggested a good idea that gets incorporated into the business. So on the one hand, there was bringing innovation in from customers and then acknowledging that back into the business in that situation. But also very much, we just started, whether it was the good old days of brainstorming that then became brain blooming and nicer terms and different things to encourage the people that do the job, stakeholders that the organizations may work with, to get them in a room, or different forms of the innovation in engineer people. They have green belt, red belt, they have all of these, a bit like a martial art way of recognizing people who are not just for the qualification point of view, more for the recognition point of view of taking a stand for innovation, and then also in bringing with that a process to do that so that everybody in the company get involved. So it's almost a cultural thing of really opening the doors to the company that stands still and doesn't believe in creativity, that doesn't look to innovate, will invariably not be there in not that many years. So we would probably look at it from a cultural point of view to encourage as many people as had a role to keep the company sustainable, and invariably that's the creativity and then the outcome, the distinction you made of the innovation to keep the company growing and moving forward.
And Deming is a perfect example of what you're talking about. You've mentioned Deming several times, and I think he's it's useful to talk about his work in Japan. So Deming, an American, goes to Japan and just totally transforms the business culture and takes Japan from, like maybe in the 60s and the 70s, if something had made in Japan
low quality,
it was similar to having made in Hong Kong stamped on it. It wasn't seen to be of very high quality, but Deming was the person who transformed the business culture using the culturally appropriate style, Kaizen, the continuous improvement strategy, which was appropriate for the Japanese culture, this thing of like continuously striving and working on this, like not being complacent. And so he's a great example of somebody who transformed the culture. But do you think he could have done that in America? Because I think creativity, the positioning of one person within a context is really important. Do you think that he was successful taking himself outside of America and into a new culture where his ideas were useful, whereas they might not have been useful in his own country?
Well, if you look at the US at that time after the war, because he went in under part of the MacArthur plan, didn't he, to rebuild Japan, that the States was on a completely different ray of its development in terms of maybe their innovators, if you like, at that time, the Henry Fords as was, and Woolworths and that generation of sort of entrepreneurs. The States was just on mass consumerism, whereas maybe the need for a man in this case, or a process like Deming's work, wasn't perceived as necessary for the US at that time, whereas Japan welcomed it with open arms for it, or it would appear welcomed it, certainly embraced it and then utilized it, because it had very different needs, which was a completely rebuilding and restructuring. And maybe it's that putting up of the hand that says we have to change, whether an economy or a company or a public institution has to reach that point of we need to change, we need to improve, or whatever's the driving imperative, at which point the space is created for a body of knowledge or a person, or in that case Deming is created. So probably at the time didn't believe it needed the Demings of this world or anything that represented. It was kind of this big gung-ho economic empire, whereas Japan was completely retrenching itself culturally, economically, a whole range of things that somehow Deming became a fit with that. Certainly if you bring that up to today in British terms, and the changes that all the things that have changed here in the last year, I personally would see as a huge opportunity. And, you know, for all of us that are in the country and people that want to be here, that's that call to action that says, what does that now mean? And that's our opportunity to be creative and innovate what we're going to do next. So maybe it's the call to action or the acceptance of it's time to move forward or it's time to reinvent. That was the difference at the time between why the Japanese embraced Deming and the US clearly didn't feel the need until 40 odd years later to start Sigma Sixing his type work into the States.
That's right. So there has to be this kind of culture of necessity. You know, they say that necessity is the mother of invention in many respects. And also the thing about diversity, there are strong links between creativity and diversity. So Deming going to Japan, he was diverse. He was bringing in ideas that maybe would not have arisen in the local culture because it had to come from outside. You know, whatever, there's that saying, like, if we need to, in order to grow, we need to be nurtured from the external environment, don't we?
It certainly seems sometimes that's the not invented here type theme, and that external person just brings that newness or something different that somehow touches the core ethos, and then everything triggers from there. The dominoes start falling as a result of it. Yes, so the student is the teacher. I always get the line the wrong way around, but the teacher, you know, when the teacher arrives, the student is ready, or vice versa. Is it horse and cart, or which one came first?
Yeah, when the student is ready, the teacher appears.
Ready, the teacher arrives. Yeah, teacher will appear.
So, in terms of diversity in the business world, I think in the global business environment, you know, I can't imagine anybody would argue with the fact that we need to have diversity. There's an example today in the Independent of in Germany, a supermarket just emptied all of its shelves from any products that were not made in Germany, and they were almost bare, just to prove the point of that without diversity, life would be indeed quite boring. So in terms of that's in the papers today. So I thought that was a good example of a creative approach to illustrating the importance of diversity. So in your own work in business, do you see any other examples of how diversity really nurtures and supports creativity?
Well, I think your example is a lovely example, isn't it? We've got reverb on my. We seem to have. We've got a little chap that's up on the sign. Standard definition. I shall press on. It's almost there's diversity there, but we don't know it. And I think your supermarket example illustrates that perfectly. That, you know, if they took all the non-German products out of a German supermarket and suddenly the shelves are bare. But if you asked most people, I don't know, but let's make the assumption that it would be the other way around, that they think it's 80% German and 20% unusual oddments and a bit of Italian, a bit of British, and a bit of, you know, various parts of the world. And a silly sort of example is, in the same way, is like a football team that the best football teams and most teams that involve, you know, a number of people, the different positions are by definition quite different. The goalkeepers are a particular type. They tend to be taller. They obviously have different wear and tear on their bodies than the smaller players that might play in the middle of a team. So if you look at those 11 outfield players in something as sort of broad as football, but if you ask the mass population, just like us at the supermarket, how important was diversity to that team? Here would be my sort of take on it. Most people almost wouldn't. What do you mean? They're all footballers. Yeah, but they're all different types of footballers in that team. So it's the recognition. I would kind of make the statement, I think, that in business, depending on industries and to a degree geography at certain places, because in this country, London diverse, there's kind of a more awareness, whether it's an acceptance of the importance of diversity, I'm not so sure, but certainly awareness. Whereas in places that don't seem to be as homogenized, then the diversity is there, as per the example you've just given, but it almost pulls to people's attention, of which again the supermarket's a great example, so that without it being seen as diversity in the slightly, it may get lost amongst some of the PC or anti-PC brigade, but almost diversity in this sense of how much different talents, different cultures, different backgrounds, that creativity and innovation. It's almost like that bit needs a PR to really bring it to people's attention, just how dynamic those differences are, that are differences, not things that cause breakups or disharmony. Actually, they create creativity and innovation. So it's almost like it really needs more of the supermarket example to highlight just how it's like the fish doesn't know it's in water. It's like we don't know we're in a diverse environment, so we don't really celebrate it or know how to.
That's right. That's right, because I think that there's a lot of, I suppose people like to be comfortable, and when, you know, in their attempt to create certainty so that they can be comfortable, there's this tendency to think that any diversity will perhaps disrupt their comfort, will cause, yeah.
It's the disruption bit that people, and it's become the whole disruption area as ultimately a good thing, but it depends. If you're the one being disrupted, then you may well be trying to keep the status quo, which doesn't really exist in nature very often. Everything is dynamically changing, but we can be a bit holding on to things, which means that diversity in that context can be a threat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a very important point that you've made about the dynamic change, you know, that nothing in nature remains constant.
No, we can't stay the same whether we like it or not.
That's right. Okay, well, Mark, thank you very much. I really enjoyed my discussion with you, and I look forward to speaking more with you about the subject of creativity.
Well, it's a big subject that we all need to learn from and do something with, so if I can help, I'm happy to do that.
Thank you very much, Mark. I look forward to it.
Jesvir.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.